Heidegger's Being and Time, A Search for Meaning. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, Sein und die Zeit, published in 1927, is not merely a philosophical treatise. It is a profound and often unsettling interrogation into the very nature of existence. The book stands as a cornerstone of 20th-century continental philosophy, challenging nearly 3 millennia of Western metaphysical tradition. Its enduring importance stems from its radical claim that the most fundamental question, the question of being, has been forgotten, or at least severely obscured, by philosophy since the time of the early Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. The central argument of being and time is that philosophy has historically focused on beings, specific things that exist, like trees, tables, or minds, without first settling the issue of being itself, the underlying meaning of the word, is. Heidegger calls this error the forgetting of being, Seinsvergessenheit. In his view, by treating being as an obvious, self-evident concept, philosophy lost its foundation, collapsing into an analysis of entities rather than the condition for their existence. Heidegger thus set out to revive this forgotten question, not by providing a quick, abstract definition of being, but by embarking on a detailed, patient, and descriptive analysis of the one entity for whom being is always a question, human existence. This entity he famously terms Dasein, a German word literally meaning being there. Dasein is, therefore, the necessary and central access point for the entire inquiry. The choice of Dasein as the starting point is crucial. Heidegger insists that Dasein is not merely an object to be studied scientifically, nor is it simply the traditional philosophical subject, like Descartes' residential cogitans or thinking thing. Instead, Dasein is defined by its very relationship to its own being. It is the entity that not only exists but understands that it exists and constantly projects possibilities for its own future existence. This is what Heidegger calls the ontological priority of Dasein. The being of the human being is unique because, for this entity, its existence is always an issue. Unlike a rock or a tool, Dasein's essence is not fixed. Its essence is its existence, and it must constantly become who it is through its choices and projects. The method employed to analyze Dasein is called the fundamental ontology, or the analytic of Dasein. It is a method heavily influenced by phenomenology, aiming to describe the phenomena of human existence as they are encountered in the world, before any theoretical or scientific overlay. The goal is to uncover the necessary, fundamental structures that make human life possible and intelligible. Key to this analysis is the concept of being in the world, in der Welt sein. This radical proposition immediately dismantles the traditional philosophical dichotomy between a subject, the inner consciousness, and an object, the external world. For Heidegger, Dasein is never an isolated consciousness that must somehow link itself to the world. It is fundamentally situated, involved, and merged with a meaningful, instrumental environment from the start. The ultimate ambition of the book, as laid out in its ambitious but partially unfinished blueprint, was to move from this detailed description of Dasein's temporary and finite existence, the analytic of Dasein, to the universal determination of the meaning of being in general. Heidegger intended to show how Dasein's unique temporality provides the horizon, the necessary condition, for all understanding of being. However, the sheer difficulty of the text cannot be overstated. Being and Time is renowned for its dense, innovative, and often intimidating neologisms, such as Werfenheit, thrownness, Sorg, care/concern, and das Man, the they. Heidegger intentionally repurposed common German words or created new compounds to force readers to abandon their traditional, ingrained metaphysical assumptions and grasp the concepts freshly. In sum, Being and Time is an attempt to lay bare the most basic philosophical ground. It compels the reader to confront existence through the lens of finitude, anxiety, and death, not as mere unfortunate incidents, but as essential constituents of a meaningful life. It is, ultimately, a foundational text whose primary purpose remains the reawakening of the human being's most profound and neglected inquiry, the search for the meaning of what it means to be, the priority of the question of being. Heidegger opens the substantive philosophical inquiry of being and time by asserting the absolute necessity of reawakening the question of being. This is not a casual topic. For Heidegger, it is the foundational task that Western philosophy has erroneously bypassed since antiquity. He contends that every other philosophical, scientific, or even everyday inquiry, from ethics and logic to physics and anthropology, already presupposes some understanding of what it means to be, yet this understanding remains fundamentally unclarified. The urgency of this task is rooted in Heidegger's belief that the term being has degenerated into a meaningless generality. Philosophers often dismiss it as the most universal, and thus the emptiest of concepts. Heidegger, however, argues precisely the opposite. Its universality does not make it empty. Rather, it underscores its transcendental significance. Being is what makes any particular being, an entity, intelligible as existing at all. We must, therefore, stop treating is as a simple placeholder and recognize it as the profound, unexamined core of all thought. To properly investigate being, Heidegger must identify the entity through which this question can be addressed. He rules out inanimate objects, abstract concepts, or even non-human animals, as these entities do not inherently care about their own existence. He focuses instead on the entity we ourselves are, the human being, which he names Dasein, literally, being there. Dasein is not just a being. It is the being whose very essence is its existence and, crucially, whose being is inherently characterized by an understanding of being. The move to Dasein establishes the ontological priority of this particular entity. Dasein is not merely present at hand like a rock. It is distinguished by the fact that in its being, it is concerned about its very being. This constant, fundamental concern, or sorg, care, means that Dasein's existence is always an open question, a set of possibilities it must constantly realize or fail to realize. Dasein is an existential entity in the truest sense. This existential characteristic provides the hermeneutical starting point for the entire project. Heidegger's analysis of Dasein is therefore a fundamental ontology, meaning it is the prerequisite groundwork for any regional ontology, the study of the being of a specific domain, like biology or mathematics. We must analyze the fundamental structures of Dasein first because it is the place where being is disclosed and articulated. Furthermore, Heidegger justifies this approach by highlighting the three essential features of Dasein's relationship to being. First, Dasein has a pre-ontological understanding of being. We constantly use the word is correctly in everyday speech, indicating a vague, operative grasp of existence. Second, Dasein is ontically superior because it is the only entity for whom the question of its own being is always relevant. Third, Dasein is ontologically primary because only through an analysis of Dasein's specific mode of being can we hope to formulate the meaning of being in general. The core methodological move is thus articulated. The investigation into the meaning of being must be achieved through an analytic of Dasein. This analytic will not delve into anthropology or psychology. It is not an empirical study of human behavior. Instead, it is an existential analytic, aiming to uncover the transcendental structures that necessarily belong to Dasein's being, irrespective of specific cultural or historical content. Heidegger is careful to distinguish between the ontic and the ontological. The ontic refers to the facts, specific experiences, and empirical properties of a being, e.g., Dasein is a student, feels sad, lives in a city. The ontological refers to the fundamental structure of the being of that entity, e.g., Dasein's temporality, its being in the world, its care. The goal of Chapter 1 is to ensure the inquiry remains rigorously focused on the ontological level. By placing Dasein at the center, Heidegger is not elevating humanity as the pinnacle of creation. Rather, he is recognizing its unique burden and capability as the shepherd of being. Only Dasein can serve as the designated entity through which the forgotten question can be resurrected and pursued. It is the entity capable of moving from a vague, implicit understanding of is to an explicit, articulated philosophical understanding. In conclusion, Chapter 1 functions as the crucial philosophical manifesto of being and time. It is the argument for why all subsequent, detailed, and difficult analyses of worldliness, care, death, and temporality are necessary. The entire edifice of the book rests on this initial, powerful assertion that the only way to search for the meaning of being is to first inquire into the being of that being which questions it, the uniquely self-interpreting entity known as Dasein. Dasein's analytic. Having established the unique ontological status of Dasein as the necessary route to the question of being, Heidegger now embarks on his core methodological project, the Analytic of Dasein. This is not a casual survey of human behaviors or emotions, but a rigorous and systematic description of the fundamental structures that make up Dasein's being. Heidegger's goal is to lay bare the essential framework of human existence, what he calls the Existentials, which are to ontology what categories, like substance or quantity, were to traditional metaphysics. The starting point for this analysis is everydayness, Alltäglichkeit, which is the most common and average way in which Dasein exists. This choice is deliberate. Heidegger argues that authenticity is not a state one achieves from the outside. Rather, it is always a possibility that is rooted in, and must be won from, the inauthentic mode of everyday life. By first understanding how we are in our ordinary, unthinking moments, we can see the full range of our potential. A central concept introduced here is being in the world, in der Welt sein. This is the basic, irreducible structure of Dasein. Heidegger meticulously argues against the traditional Cartesian model that posits an isolated, internal subject, the residential cogitans, or thinking thing, separate from an external world of objects, residential extensa. For Heidegger, this subject-object split is a philosophical error that misrepresents our lived experience. We are never just a consciousness in a body, which is in a world. We are always, already immersed and engaged with the world. This immersion is not a physical state, it is a hermeneutical one. The world, in being in the world, is not a mere collection of physical objects but a network of meanings and relations. The world is primarily understood as a collection of equipment, Zug, things defined by their readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit. A hammer, for example, is not first a piece of wood and metal. It is a tool for hammering, an entity whose very being is its involvement in a human project. Heidegger highlights the distinction between readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit, and presence at hand, Vorhandenheit. Most of the time, we deal with things in the world in the mode of readiness to hand, meaning we are simply using them for a purpose without thinking about them as separate objects. It is only when a tool breaks or becomes unusable that it suddenly loses its functionality and stands out as a simple object, a mere physical thing, in the mode of presence at hand. Another crucial concept is facticity, Faktizitat, which Heidegger defines as Dasein's thrownness, Geworfenheit. This means that Dasein is always already in a world that it did not choose. We are thrown into a specific historical and cultural context, a specific body, and with a specific past. This thrownness is not a constraint on our freedom but the very condition for it. Our choices and projects are always made from within this given facticity. Heidegger also introduces concern, Sorg, which is the unified structure of Dasein's being as a whole. All of Dasein's activities, whether they are using a tool, talking with others, or facing a personal crisis, are ultimately expressions of its fundamental concern for its own being. Care encompasses Dasein's thrownness into its past, its projects for the future, and its engagement in the present. Heidegger's analysis reveals that Dasein is always ahead of itself. It is constantly projecting into the future. My being is not defined by what I am right now, but by the possibilities that I can choose and become. This forward-looking aspect is what gives Dasein a sense of purpose and direction, as it is always striving to realize its potential. The Analytic of Dasein is also a critique of traditional notions of the self. Heidegger argues that the who of Dasein is not a fixed, unchanging substance but is to be found in its everydayness. This means the self is not a static ego but a dynamic, relational entity that exists through its engagements and relationships in the world. Our selfhood is inextricably linked to the projects we pursue and the people we are with. In summary, the second chapter of Being and Time provides the essential conceptual tools for the rest of the book. It is here that Heidegger meticulously deconstructs our common-sense notions of self and world, laying the groundwork for his more radical claims about authenticity, anxiety, and death. By showing that Dasein is a unified structure of being in the world that is thrown, engaged, and always ahead of itself, Heidegger sets the stage for a truly existential understanding of human existence. Worldliness and being in the world. Heidegger dedicates this critical chapter to fully elucidating the first and most fundamental existential structure of Dasein, being in the world, in der Welt sein. This concept is his direct assault on the traditional philosophical view that sees the human being as an internal consciousness, subject, that must somehow bridge a gap to an external reality, object. Heidegger insists that this dualism fundamentally misrepresents our lived, primal reality. Dasein is never in the world like water is in a glass, but rather is constituted by its involvement with the world. The world, Welt, here does not refer to the physical planet or the totality of all things. Instead, it is an ontological structure, a framework of meaning and significance that provides the context for Dasein's existence. This world is not merely observed, it is encountered, used, and understood through practical engagement. The world is the organized totality of what matters to Dasein, a network of relationships, purposes, and references that make sense of any particular entity encountered within it. The core of this engagement is found in Heidegger's analysis of equipment, Zug, and readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit. We encounter things not as isolated physical objects, like mass, color, and shape, but as tools defined by their utility and purpose. A door, a pen, or a street sign is not primarily seen as a piece of material but as something to be used for something. The being of these entities lies precisely in their involvement in a network of assignments and projects. This primary mode of encountering things, readiness to hand, is characterized by circumspection, Umsicht. This is the kind of understanding we employ when we are skillfully using a tool, such as hammering a nail. In this state, the hammer itself disappears into its function. The user is not consciously thinking about the hammer as a physical object, but is focused entirely on the work being done. Circumspection is thus a form of non-thematic, practical understanding that governs most of our daily existence. Heidegger introduces a crucial contrast with presence at hand, Vorhandenheit. This is the mode in which entities appear when they are viewed theoretically, scientifically, or abstractly, as pure objects of study, stripped of their purpose and function. When the hammer breaks, or when a tool is missing, it loses its readiness to hand and suddenly stands out as an isolated, inert, physical thing. Only then does it become present at hand. The transition from one mode to the other reveals the ontological priority of functional, involved being. The network of equipment is ultimately tied to Dasein's own projects and possibilities. The nail exists for the beam, the hammer for the nail, and the whole arrangement exists for the purpose of shelter, which is a possibility Dasein is pursuing. This means that the world structure is, for the sake of Dasein, willen. The entirety of the equip-mental totality is ultimately referenced back to Dasein's care, Sorg, its fundamental concern for its own being. The world is also necessarily shared. The kind of being that Dasein has is not solitary but is fundamentally a being with, Mitsein, others. The tools we use, the pen, the language, the public transportation, are all products of a shared culture and are defined by a common understanding of their function. Even when Dasein is alone, the world is still populated by the implied presence of others, whose concerns and interpretations shape the meaning of everything encountered. This social dimension introduces the concept of the anyone, or they self, das Man, which is the dominant, public mode of interpretation that shapes the average, everyday world. The standards, norms, and opinions that define proper use, correct talk, and acceptable behavior are products of this anonymous, they. The world we are thrown into is pre-interpreted by the they, leading Dasein to its inauthentic mode of existence, where it merely does what one does. The world, therefore, is not merely a setting, but the very meaning horizon within which Dasein interprets its own existence. It is the structured place where Dasein is disclosed, Erschlossenheit. The world discloses itself to Dasein through practical activity, moods, and understanding, providing the context that allows Dasein to make sense of its facticity and pursue its possibilities. In essence, Chapter 3 establishes that Dasein's most basic existential reality is its complete, involved immersion in a purposeful, social world. This groundbreaking concept of being in the world not only refutes traditional subject-object metaphysics but also paves the way for the subsequent, deeper analyses of inauthenticity, anxiety, and temporality, all of which must be understood as modifications of Dasein's fundamental relationship to its world. Falling, and the they. In this pivotal chapter, Heidegger pivots his analysis of Dasein from its fundamental structures, being in the world, to its dominant mode of existence in everyday life, falling, verfallen. This term does not carry a moral or theological connotation of a fall from grace. Rather, falling is an ontological movement, a natural, constant, and pervasive tendency for Dasein to lose itself, to become absorbed in the world of equipment and, more critically, in the interpretations and pronouncements of others. The agent of this absorption is the they self, or simply the they, Dasein. The they is not a specific group of people, nor is it a sociological category. It is an anonymous public self, a kind of averaged, common denominator of how one acts, judges, talks, and feels. It is the tyranny of the impersonal pronoun, one does this, one thinks that, or one simply doesn't do that. The they is the self one is when one is not authentically one's own self. The function of the they is to provide Dasein with a form of tranquilizing certainty. By conforming to the standards and interpretations established by the public average, Dasein avoids the unsettling responsibility of making its own, unique choices about its existence. This absorption grants a comforting sense of being at home in the world, sparing Dasein the burden of its inherent freedom and the anxiety that comes with it. Heidegger identifies three key characteristics of the discourse and behavior of the they: gossip, Gerede, curiosity, Neugier, and ambiguity, Zweideutigkeit. Gossip represents the superficial, circular spreading of what is already familiar, where understanding is replaced by mere chatter, cutting off genuine inquiry. Curiosity is the restless, novelty-seeking urge to see everything without truly understanding anything, constantly moving to the next thing without dwelling. The third characteristic, ambiguity, is the resulting outcome. In the realm of the they, it becomes impossible to distinguish what is genuinely understood from what is merely repeated, or what is truly important from what is trivial. Everything becomes flattened out to a public, interchangeable interpretation, making it difficult for Dasein to grasp its own unique possibilities amidst the din of common opinion. The essence of falling is inauthenticity, Uneigentlichkeit. It is vital to understand that this is not a bad state, it is Dasein's default, everyday mode of being. Inauthenticity means that Dasein has lost ownership of its existence. It is being defined by public norms and expectations rather than its own chosen possibilities. The self becomes dispersed into the they, becoming a generic anyone. Falling is rooted in Dasein's inherent tendency to flee from its own being. What Dasein flees is the unsettling realization of its facticity, its thrownness, and the radical freedom that accompanies it. The they offers a convenient sanctuary, assuring Dasein that everything is normal, everything is understood, and one's existence is essentially manageable, thus dulling the sharp edge of existential concern. Paradoxically, even the most authentic possibility, a self-chosen life, must be wrested from this state of falling. The they is not something external that Dasein can simply leave behind, it is an existential structure inherent to Dasein's being with others. Therefore, Dasein's authentic self is not found by retreating into isolation, but by taking a resolute stance within the public world, but against the dictates of the they. The analysis of falling and the they serves a critical purpose in Heidegger's larger project. It isolates the obstacles that prevent Dasein from engaging in a genuine inquiry into its own being. It reveals how the public interpretation of life, the realm of common sense and scientific observation, is actually a profound concealment of Dasein's deeper ontological reality. In conclusion, Chapter 4 exposes the existential trap of conformity and the profound difficulty Dasein faces in achieving genuine selfhood. By describing the anonymous, leveling power of the they, Heidegger sets the stage for the dramatic, disclosive events, anxiety and the call of conscience, that are necessary to wrench Dasein out of its comfortable inauthenticity and place it squarely before the question of its own unique, finite possibilities. Anxiety and the call of conscience. Heidegger introduces Chapter 5 by isolating the crucial psychological and existential events necessary to wrench Dasein out of its pervasive inauthenticity and the anonymity of the they, Dasein. The forces capable of achieving this transformation are the affective state of anxiety, angst, and the unique phenomenon he terms the call of conscience. These are not minor subjective experiences, they are profound disclosive moments that reveal Dasein's deepest ontological truth. Anxiety is meticulously distinguished from fear, Furcht. Fear always has a specific object. One is afraid of a bear, a bill, or a failure. Anxiety, by contrast, is objectless. Its threat is not any specific thing in the world but the world as a whole, or more accurately, the fundamental nothingness that underpins Dasein's existence. The familiar network of equipment and social roles suddenly loses its significance, and Dasein feels profoundly at home, Unheimlichkeit. In anxiety, the world falls away or becomes insignificant, and what remains is Dasein's own self, isolated and exposed to its radical freedom. Anxiety reveals to Dasein that its existence is not a fixed, secure state, but a constant burden of possibility. Dasein is forced to confront the fact that it is a null basis, the source of its own choices, but simultaneously lacking any external foundation or pre-given essence to guide those choices. The experience of anxiety prepares Dasein for the phenomenon of the call of conscience, Ruf des Gewissens. Heidegger radically reinterprets conscience, stripping it of conventional moral or religious overtones. The call of conscience is not a demand to adhere to a set of ethical rules, it is an impersonal, silent summons that comes from Dasein to Dasein itself, urging it toward its own authentic potential. The call speaks only in silence because any articulated demand would immediately fall back into the language and norms of the they. It calls Dasein to its ownest potentiality for being, which is the possibility of guilt, Schuldgeschehen. Heidegger defines existential guilt not as having committed a specific transgression, but as the fundamental structural feature of Dasein as a nullifying basis. Existential guilt stems from the fact that Dasein, as a finite, thrown entity, is always choosing one possibility while simultaneously nullifying, not choosing, countless others. We are always indebted to a past we didn't choose, thrownness, and we are the source of our own projects, yet this source is itself a void of possibilities. Guilt is thus the ontological recognition of Dasein's inherent finitude and self-reliance in its choices. The response to the call of conscience is wanting to have a conscience, Gewissen haben wollen, which manifests as resoluteness, Entschlossenheit. Resoluteness is not a plan or an impulsive decision, it is a fundamental openness and readiness to accept one's guilt, one's thrownness, and the necessity of choosing oneself. It is the steady, resolute affirmation of Dasein's own unique, though terrifying, existence. Resoluteness is not achieved by escaping the world, but by returning to one's factical situation, the specific world one is thrown into, and acting within it, but now with authenticity, Eigentlichkeit. The resolute self does not invent new values, it takes over the possibilities offered by its heritage, but it does so as its own, fully aware of its responsibility and finitude, thus stripping the power from the anonymous, they. Together, anxiety and the call of conscience function as Dasein's clearing, Lichtung. They tear Dasein away from its preoccupation with specific beings, tools, social status, everyday concerns, and force it to confront its own being as a matter of possibility and choice. This confrontation shatters the illusion of safety provided by the public world and illuminates Dasein's standing before its ultimate and non-relational limit. In sum, Chapter 5 is where Heidegger defines the path to authentic selfhood. By describing anxiety as the affective state that reveals Dasein's null foundation and by interpreting the conscience as the silent call to accept this fundamental guilt, Heidegger provides the existential key. This resoluteness, born of anxiety and guilt, enables Dasein to grasp its whole being in preparation for the ultimate existential limit, being toward death. Being toward death. In this profound and perhaps most famous chapter of Being and Time, Heidegger confronts the ultimate limit of human existence, death. He is not concerned with death as a biological event, but as a fundamental existential possibility that defines Dasein's very being. For Heidegger, to understand Dasein authentically is to understand it in relation to its own demise. Being toward death, Sein zum Tod, is not a morbid fascination but the essential condition for Dasein to grasp its wholeness and individuality. Heidegger begins by analyzing the everyday way in which Dasein relates to death, which he calls the inauthentic mode. In the realm of the Dasein, death is treated as an event that happens to one, but never to me. It is viewed as an unfortunate occurrence that others experience, an event to be managed and discussed impersonally. This is the public, socialized way of dealing with death, which effectively covers up its true significance for the individual. The inauthentic attitude towards death is one of constant flight and avoidance. We say, one dies, and in so doing, we relegate death to the realm of the impersonal, the public, and the predictable. This socialized perspective makes death appear as something to be awaited, but not genuinely owned. It allows Dasein to escape the terrifying burden of its finitude, maintaining the illusion of a continuous, unending existence. To achieve an authentic relationship with death, Dasein must first face it as a possibility that is irrevocably its own. Death is the non-relational possibility, meaning it is an event that cannot be shared or experienced with another. No one can die my death for me. This absolute solitude reveals Dasein's ultimate individuality and tears it away from the comfort of the they and its impersonal norms. Heidegger outlines three key characteristics of death as an existential possibility. First, it is certain. We know that we will die. Second, it is indeterminate. We do not know when or how. Third, it is non-relational, as previously mentioned. These three features combined make death Dasein's most unique and decisive possibility, because it is the one possibility that puts an end to all others. The authentic way of relating to death is not a passive waiting but an active running ahead, Vorlaufen, to it. This running ahead is a form of anticipation, a resolutely chosen attitude of facing death as an ever-present possibility. It is not about hurrying toward the end but about embracing the finality of one's existence, allowing it to define and give meaning to every moment and every choice. By anticipating its death, Dasein gains a crucial perspective on its life. It realizes that all its projects, relationships, and concerns are finite and must be chosen with full awareness of this end. The full import of its thrownness into a life it didn't choose and its responsibility to project its own self into the future become clearer and more urgent. The everyday pursuits of they lose their tranquilizing power. This authentic encounter with death provides the ultimate basis for authenticity itself. When Dasein grasps its existence as a finite whole, it becomes truly free from the trivialities and social pressures of the public world. It can make choices not based on what one does, but based on its own, unique potentiality. Death, far from being a negative event, thus becomes a liberating force. Heidegger's analysis challenges centuries of philosophical and religious attempts to abstractly define death or mitigate its terror. For him, death is not a problem to be solved or an event to be overcome, but an essential structure of being in the world. It is the non-existent possibility that makes all other possibilities meaningful and urgent. In conclusion, the chapter on being toward death stands as the climax of Heidegger's existential analytic. It is the point where all the previous concepts, thrownness, being in the world, anxiety, and resoluteness, converge. By bravely facing its own finitude, Dasein finds the key to its unique existence and its authentic freedom, finally grasping its own being as a finite, purposeful, and self-chosen whole. Resoluteness and temporality. Chapter 7 serves as the culmination of Heidegger's analytic of Dasein, bringing together the concepts of authenticity and finitude to reveal the ultimate ground of Dasein's structure, temporality, Zeitlichkeit. The movement from the inauthentic everyday self to the authentic self, facilitated by anxiety and the confrontation with death, finds its expression in the active mode of resoluteness, Entschlossenheit. Resoluteness is the key existential concept for authentic living. It is not a mere decision or an impulsive act, it is the fundamental openness and readiness to take ownership of one's own being, defined by its ultimate finitude. Resoluteness is the disclosed understanding that Dasein is guilty in the existential sense, that it is a null basis that must choose itself while accepting its inherent thrownness into a world it did not create. The resolute Dasein stands firm in the face of the unsettling truth revealed by anxiety, which is the nothingness that makes its existence a constant task. By resolving, Dasein chooses to engage with its specific, factical world, the world of its birth, its circumstances, and its shared culture, but does so with a full awareness that its choices are its own and are made under the shadow of its impending death. It is a resolute return to the everyday, but now with understanding. Heidegger argues that this authentic grasp of Dasein's wholeness, a being defined by its end, death, and its beginning, thrownness, is only possible because Dasein is fundamentally temporal. All the structures uncovered previously are rooted in time. Care, Sorg, the total structure of Dasein, can be explicitly expressed as being ahead of itself, in being already in a world, as being alongside. The three structural moments of care correspond directly to the three dimensions of ecstatic temporality. Being ahead of itself, Dasein's projection into its possibilities, is rooted in the future, Zukunft. Being already in a world, Dasein's thrownness, is rooted in the past, Gesenheit. And being alongside, Dasein's engagement with things in the present, is rooted in the present, Gegenwart. Crucially, these temporal dimensions are ecstatic, meaning they stand outside themselves. The past rushes forward as Dasein's thrownness shapes its projects, the future rushes back to meet the present moment in anticipation, and the present is understood only as the juncture where the past and future converge. Dasein's existence is not a linear succession of moments but a unified stretching between its birth and its death. Authentic temporality arises from resoluteness, which unifies these ecstasies. The resolute Dasein anticipates its own death, future, retrieves its thrown heritage and possibilities, past, and makes present its choices, present. It lives toward its whole, finite self. This authentic temporality is the structure that allows Dasein to be truly historical, to choose its past and project its future as its own. In contrast, inauthentic temporality is characteristic of the everyday they self. This mode is dominated by the present, where Dasein is absorbed by the urgency of immediate concerns and entities present at hand. The past is forgotten or simply seen as a collection of facts, and the future is merely awaited as an endless chain of new present moments, rather than being actively anticipated as the end of all possibilities. Heidegger ultimately concludes that temporality is the meaning of care. The reason Dasein is fundamentally defined by care, by concern, by projection, by thrownness, is because Dasein is time. Temporality is not something that Dasein has but is the very fabric of its existence. It is the ontological condition for the possibility of Dasein's being as a whole. Therefore, Chapter 7 marks the culmination of the existential analytic. By demonstrating that Dasein's authentic selfhood is achieved through resoluteness, and by revealing this resoluteness as rooted in an authentic, unified temporality, Heidegger prepares the final step. He has successfully grounded the being of Dasein in time, setting the stage for the book's final, promised, but ultimately unfinished, leap to the universal question: is temporality the ultimate meaning of being itself? The question unanswered, the unfinished second half. The final section of the published text of Heidegger's Being and Time stands not as a conclusion, but as a point of rupture. After meticulously detailing the analytic of Dasein and demonstrating that temporality is the meaning of Dasein's care, Sorg, the book ends abruptly, leaving its central promise unfulfilled. Heidegger's original plan, as outlined in the introduction, was to bridge the analysis of human existence to the universal question of the meaning of being as such. This second, promised half of the work was never published in its intended form, leaving the book a powerful but incomplete fragment. The explicit purpose of the unwritten second half was to move beyond fundamental ontology, the analysis of Dasein, to metaphysics proper. Heidegger had argued that because being is only disclosed through the being of Dasein, the temporal structures of Dasein must provide the horizon for understanding being in a universal sense. The leap from the temporal analysis of a specific entity, Dasein, to the universal meaning of being as a whole was the crucial, but ultimately unmade, philosophical move. The published work concludes by stating that temporality is the meaning of care, which constitutes Dasein as a whole. But this raises the monumental question: if Dasein's being is temporal, does that mean that being itself is inherently temporal? Is time, as revealed through Dasein, the transcendental ground for all existence? The book stops short of answering this, leaving a gaping hole in its grand theoretical architecture. Heidegger's later writings and lectures, particularly those from the 1930s, provide clues as to why he never completed the work. He came to believe that the language and methodology of being and time were still too indebted to traditional metaphysical concepts, particularly the notion of the subject, Dasein, which he had tried to move beyond. He felt the project had a fundamental flaw. It risked turning being into a mere property of Dasein, thereby repeating the very error he had sought to overcome. The book's abrupt end has generated immense debate and speculation. Some scholars argue that the second half was left unwritten because the project itself was unfinishable. The very nature of the question of being, in Heidegger's view, may have resisted any final, complete answer. The task of philosophy, for him, was not to provide ultimate solutions but to keep the question of being open and in a constant state of inquiry. For other commentators, the unfinished nature of the book is seen as a deliberate act of philosophical instruction. The reader is compelled to take up the burden of the question themselves. By leaving the ultimate destination of his inquiry unwritten, Heidegger forces his audience to confront the core issue. How does one move from the profound, personal understanding of one's own existence to the universal significance of existence itself? The impact of the unfinished work cannot be understated. Being and Time remains one of the most influential texts of the 20th century, inspiring major movements like existentialism and deconstruction, even though these movements often focused only on the existential analytic of Dasein, largely ignoring the larger ontological project. This selective focus is, in part, a consequence of the book's own structure. The most accessible and powerful part is the one that is complete. The book's incompleteness also highlights a major shift in Heidegger's thought. In his later work, he increasingly turned to the study of language, poetry, and history as the site where being reveals itself, moving away from the more structured, systematic approach of being and time. This shift, known as the turn care, can be seen as his attempt to address the very issue that rendered the second half of his masterpiece impossible to write. In a sense, the book's incompleteness is a testament to the immense ambition of its author. Heidegger attempted to single-handedly revive a question that had been forgotten for thousands of years and to build a new philosophical foundation from the ground up. That he did not complete this task is less a failure than a reflection of the sheer difficulty and magnitude of the project. In conclusion, the unwritten second half of Being and Time is just as important as the published text. It stands as a powerful reminder that philosophy is often more about the questions it raises than the answers it provides. The book's conclusion, or lack thereof, challenges its readers to continue the search for meaning, not just in their own existence but in the forgotten, foundational question of being itself, leaving the ultimate response as a task for a future that may never fully arrive. Conclusion: Heidegger's Being and Time, a search for meaning. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, despite its daunting density and incomplete structure, emerges as one of philosophy's most powerful and transformative texts. It is not merely an academic exercise, it is a profound ethical call to self-awareness, urging the reader to confront existence in its radical finitude. The book's fundamental achievement lies in its successful revival of the question of being, a question that had been buried under centuries of metaphysical assumptions that prioritized entities over the sheer fact of existence. The lasting legacy of the work resides in its meticulous and groundbreaking analytic of Dasein. By identifying the human being not as a detached subject but as being in the world, in der Welt sein, Heidegger irrevocably altered the philosophical landscape. He demonstrated that our primary mode of engagement is not theoretical contemplation but practical, skilled involvement with a meaningful environment, the world of readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit. This shifted the focus from abstract thought to concrete lived experience. The conceptual framework built around Dasein, centered on care, Sorg, offered a revolutionary portrait of the self. Heidegger revealed that Dasein's existence is a constant tension between its thrownness, Geworfenheit, into a pre-given world and its ability to project, Entwurf, its own possibilities. This inherent dynamic ensures that existence is always an open question, a possibility to be seized, not a predetermined state to be passively accepted. Crucially, the book illuminates the profound nature of inauthenticity, Uneigentlichkeit. The analysis of the they-self, das Man, serves as a powerful critique of modern conformity, highlighting how easily Dasein falls, verfallen, into the anonymity of public interpretation to escape the burden of individual choice. This falling is not a moral failing but a structural, tempting comfort that masks Dasein's true potential. The path to authentic selfhood is dramatically unveiled through the concepts of anxiety, angst, and resoluteness, Entschlossenheit. Anxiety, the objectless mood, tears Dasein away from the superficiality of the they, by revealing the nothingness that grounds its existence. Resoluteness is the authentic response, a courageous acceptance of one's existential guilt and one's radical freedom to choose oneself in the face of absolute finitude. The central axis around which the entire analysis turns is being toward death, sane zum Tod. Heidegger transforms death from a biological end into an existential possibility that gives structure and urgency to life. By running ahead to this non-relational, certain, yet indeterminate limit, Dasein becomes free from the trivial concerns of the everyday, allowing it to grasp its existence as a finite, purposeful whole. All these existential structures, care, anxiety, guilt, and being toward death, ultimately converge to reveal the transcendental ground of Dasein, temporality, Zeitlichkeit. By demonstrating that Dasein's being is a unified stretching between its past, thrownness, its future, anticipation of death, and its present, resolute choice, Heidegger asserts that Dasein is time, and that time is the horizon through which we understand ourselves. The book's unfinished nature, the missing second half that was to make the leap to the universal meaning of being, only amplifies its importance. The break forces the philosophical community and every individual reader to dwell in the open-endedness of the inquiry. It suggests that perhaps the greatest insight is that being cannot be captured by a final formula, but must be continuously thought and questioned. Heidegger's impact resonates deeply across various disciplines, from literature and theology to psychology and critical theory. His insistence on the priority of existence over essence, a concept later central to existentialism, and his meticulous deconstruction of metaphysical language set the stage for much of subsequent continental thought. The very vocabulary we use to discuss meaning, selfhood, and authenticity is indebted to his radical formulations. In conclusion, Being and Time is more than a historical document, it is a permanent philosophical challenge. It is the definitive account of the search for meaning embedded in the human condition, forcing us to acknowledge that to be human is to be fundamentally a question. The book demands that we move beyond the passive, impersonal existence of the they, and embrace the anxiety and responsibility of a resolute, finite, and self-chosen life, making the pursuit of meaning the highest and most difficult task of all.